I think it's also very satisfying. So getting paid for something I think it's not so much about a specific amount of money in the bank. It's just the kind of appreciation that somebody, and it's not easy to get money even in pharmaceutical industry, but if somebody takes the step and pays for it, I think it's a very important reward, not just financially, but also psychologically, emotionally.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Jan, very well welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks very much for having me. I always like to talk about entrepreneurship and my company.
You're in the perfect spot here today. You're the co-founder and CEO at InSphero, the first commercial producer of organotypic and three-dimensional microtissues for drug development and screening. Before we talk about your company, what you exactly do, I want to start with your personal background. You spent almost a decade at university studying microtechnology. So were you on track to become a professor, a PhD, and also really a researcher in the end?
Yeah, no, totally not. I really loved and cherished the time in the academic institutions that I had the chance to attend to. But for me, there was always a means to an end, right? And so my interest has always been developing technologies and then turning these technologies into products and ideally products into solutions. That's how I tick. The scientific inspiration, I think, is not so much what gets me out of bed. What I like is that people use what we've developed.
And you already did that back in 1996 during your master's. You actually built a startup called AMMT, and you worked there until 2007. Can you talk a bit more about that journey?
Yeah, so that was what really kind of get my entrepreneurial gene activated, I would say. It was a project that came out of one of my university projects, and a friend and we both know each other from a German Young Scientist contest, Jugend forscht. We decided, hey, let's get going, right? And this was only part-time. So he pursued his PhD. I pursued my PhD in Neuchâtel in Switzerland. But it was a great success. We worked with companies like IBM and NASA. But it was on the one hand fantastic to see what does it take to create a company, from development of products to marketing to sales to accounting to tax filings and stuff like that. So I found out I really loved this, but at the same time, we never had a business plan. We never had a plan to really expand and to, change the way how things are in this domain. So when I had a chance to sell my shares in the company in 2007, I took it and then decided to wait until the next inspiration came.
Right. And in between, you worked for other people before then jumping back into the entrepreneurial wagon.
Yeah.
Why was that the right move for you? Not just start another company. Was it also good to just, take a bit of a break from entrepreneurship? Because it is an exhausting journey, right?
So it is. But I think what was more driving me to the decision to go into industry was that I wanted to learn how companies work. Right? So at that time, I had never worked in a company other than my own. And I really wanted to create something large the next time that I start a company. So I never, I think, abandoned the idea of being independent. But I wanted to prepare myself as much as possible to do this well. And so the two companies that I worked for, one was a Swiss-American company, belonged to a large holding. So, understanding also how the international side of things tick was important. And then at Hokoma, I worked in the medical device field, very regulated, but also a company very successfully expanding. So understanding how you manage that growth, how you grow a team, how you identify talents, and so on, I think was really great. And I would probably still work there because it was a very fulfilling job if the idea for InSphero hadn't come up. Yeah.
And that sounds like it was a logical stepping stone for you to then start again something. Where does your ultimate entrepreneurial drive come from? Did you have any role models that inspired you or other family members that pursued that path before and also sort of served as role models?
Yeah, so interestingly, our family, I think, is not very entrepreneurial. We have law professors and we have doctors and pharmacists and so on. But my brother and I, we are both running our own company. So, I always like to do it this way. I'm not really sure where it come from. I think, however, that you can also be entrepreneurial within a company if the company has the right culture. So the 2 jobs that I had before I started InSphero, I did not feel really limited in the way how I was working. And it's that type of culture that we also try to establish at InSphero. So our VPs and our group heads, they have independence and they should act as entrepreneurs inside the enterprise, because only like that we can really, I think, get the full potential out of everybody.
Amazing. And then in 2009, that was your second company, InSphero. You were a total of 3 co-founders. So my first question, where have you met your co-founders, Jens and Wolfgang?
So first of all, they were the important ones in this company, right? They did the scientific heavy lifting. And I came in actually as the third party to starting the company. Jens and I, we met while we were both at ETH Zurich. That was around 2003. Jens had already worked on 3D cell culture at the time. We had a joint project together and became friends. And then and Jens and Wolfgang separately had worked together. Wolfgang at the University of Zurich, Jens at ETH. And then in 2008, they called me and we had a beer and they said, hey, we have this interesting idea. We are thinking about starting a company. We would like somebody with the entrepreneurial experience to be on board. And we very quickly came together, wrote a business plan. The first one was total illusion, but you need to start somewhere. And then we started to get really good feedback from the market. And then in 2009, we took the leap and founded the company, quit our jobs. It was the middle of the financial crisis, right? Everybody said, you guys are crazy. Everybody's happy to still have a job and you actively quit your job just to follow that funky dream. But it was the right time for us and it was the right time for our market, because the pharmaceutical industry started to look for better in vitro models. So it was a good coincidence.
But taking that decision, to start a company during the financial crisis, that takes some guts to do. What made you so sure that this was the right step and not, that you would just regret it very, very soon after?
I think you have this sort of naivete when you start a company, and I think it's good to have it.
I agree.
The road is full of stumbling stones, blocks, and if you think too much about that, I think you would never do it, right? You just stay with what you have. I think what was really helpful, on the one hand, we were in this Venture Kick coaching program, and the third stage of Venture Kick, I think for us was early 2009. So that really helped us and we won it, right? So there was a good confirmation to us. We are doing this well, right? Not just technically, but also from a business perspective. And then we had extremely high interest from pharmaceutical companies. And we just, had a kitchen table discussion and we said, are we doing this now, right? Because there was just one or the other option. So we met with a head of toxicology of one of the large pharmaceutical companies in Switzerland, who immediately said, hey, I'm going to visit you next Tuesday. I like what I see. I need to meet with you, which was not easy for us because we had nothing, right? We had no office and nothing. So we found an empty office at the university, put our logo on the door just for that one day. And then had him visiting. But he said, hey, I'm going to give you a contract, but you need to start the company. Right? So I'm not going to work with you while you still are undecided.
Of course.
If I put money on the table to work with you, then I want you to quit the jobs and start the company. Yeah. And so that was, I think, kind of the ultimate kick that we got. And then everything started from there.
I love this because it's the strong market feedback that you're really solving a relevant problem and someone is willing to pay for that, I think that's one of the biggest factors to say, hey, we take the leap of faith and we do it.
I fully agree. And I think it's also very satisfying. So getting paid for something I think it's not so much about a specific amount of money in the bank. It's just the kind of appreciation that somebody, and it's not easy to get money even in pharmaceutical industry, but if somebody takes the step and pays for it, I think it's a very important reward, not just financially, but also psychologically, emotionally. Yeah.
Definitely. You mentioned the importance of research in the foundation of your company. When did your co-founders start with that research, and how did you then also translate it from being a research into a company? Because that's probably harder than...
That's a great question. And so Jens had been working on 3D cell culture also already at the end of the 1990s. He did, I think, a master project in Australia. And that was when he got first in touch with the topic. The plate technology was then something that really only, I think, came about when the company was up and running. So let's say the basic science that was necessary to show that 3D cell culture works, right? That the technology is valuable and meaningful, and we'll get into it in a second. That took a decade, but then turning this science into the technology and then into products actually happened quite quickly after we started the company. And I think that has always been a bit the way how we roll, right? We try to do things fast and go through iterations. It's, something that everybody in software engineering does, but in life science, not necessarily like that. But we try to kind of adopt some of these agile approaches and rather have something that's subpar at the beginning, where we can then still try it out and get customer feedback. And we've seen that that's not only working well with customers, it brings customers on into this development journey, and it makes them co-creators of what we do.
It really is the entrepreneurial way of doing things that you mentioned, how important that is to you before, right? So now imagine you're speaking to an audience that has not a lot of knowledge about biotech. What exactly does InSphero do, and how do you also help companies in the fields of oncology and toxicology? What would you explain to people who don't really have a lot of knowledge about biotech?
Yeah. So what we are doing is we basically try to rebuild small parts of the human body in the lab so that companies in pharmaceutical research and biotech can test new compounds to see whether they have unwanted side effects and whether they work well to cure the disease, right? So we also call this toxicology and efficacy studies. And this is something that is very important in the whole drug discovery process. It is done a lot with animal testing still, which is not just an ethical concern, but it's also a scientific concern because we are not animals, right? So the pig, for instance, was a standard test animal for diabetes research. But the pancreas of the pig, people found out like 20 years later, is very, very different from the human pancreas. So something that works in the pig does not necessarily work in the human, right? And so this is why I said 2009 was a good year for us to start, because people started more and more put into question, is animal testing really the right thing to do? And we said, no, what we do is we create human in vitro models, so models that work in the lab, to allow customers to do better testing and become more predictive.
That's amazing. I wasn't aware that this is also really a scientific challenge, but that makes a lot of sense why there's an even stronger need for your solution.
I think it's really the key driver. So ethical concerns are very rarely changing things, right? So solar energy, everybody like 20 years ago was aware that coal and fossil fuels are not great sources of energy, but you still use them. When things started in Germany, for instance, to switch to solar power, which was really important for the whole world, was when the government said, we pay you a lot more for solar power than we do for regular power. And that's what things started, right? So you replace that kind of ethical dilemma between, I know it's not good, but I also don't want to spend the money, into something, I change and I win. And this is kind of what happens in the pharmaceutical industry. Before, animal tests were the gold standard, and everything else was kind of a bad compromise. And then things flip, and suddenly the animal study is actually something that nobody wants anymore because they have something better now.
Yeah, it is sort of the importance of incentives, right? You do have an advantage if you have a stronger testing ground, so to speak, and that's exactly what you provide.
Yeah, and it's this kind of what's in it for me, which is always relevant when you try to create change. If there's nothing in it for me, then change is
nothing's going to happen. Yeah. Who is your typical customer? Who do you sell your solution to?
So we are very strong in pharmaceutical research and in biotechnology. So this is really the biggest part of our market. But we also have contracts with cosmetics companies, with chemical companies. So even nutritional companies these days. Everybody who creates compounds, develops compounds that are somehow relevant to the human body, because we take them as drugs or we eat them as food additives or we get exposed to it like pesticides, somehow needs to make sure that they are safe and they do the job that they are supposed to do.
And how does your business model look like in the work?
It's actually fairly simple. So we typically, we have a strong product business and we have a strong service business. So the way how we roll is that we create these platforms, for instance, to do discovery against type 2 diabetes. And then we have customers who prefer to run these studies in-house. And for those, we've developed ways how we build these tissues and then we ship them to end users, which is very tricky, but we have a patent on our shipping solution. Or we have customers that send us their compounds and we test them on our platform for these customers. It's quite important because we see a lot of big companies want to do the testing in-house. Smaller companies sometimes don't even have a lab. Right. And then you need to be able to do that work for them. One of the exciting things that have come up over the past years is that companies are also reaching out to us to do true partnerships. So we work on one with Roche in Basel, where they asked us to develop a specific disease model that was not existing before. And so that's a great starting point for kind of an exclusive relationship where we then benefit also with the success over time.
Amazing. Yeah. That sounds like very, very promising for the future. I also want to talk about some obstacles. So I imagine in your space, the development process, but also some regulations might be quite challenging. Was that the case for you to go to market? Of
course, there are organizations like the EMA in Europe and the FDA in the US, which are basically deciding whether a drug can be tested in the clinic, right? So this is what our customers are very keen on. They need to put together a so-called IND package for the FDA, where they say, hey, this is how we tested the drug, and we believe it's safe, and we can show that it works, at least in the models that are available to us. And now the next step is that we want to test this on human test subjects. Yeah. And this is where the FDA then needs to say yes or no, and making the FDA comfortable to accept the data that we are generating, that our technology is generating, I think is a very important point. And we are very closely working with them on doing this. So getting guidance from the FDA and from other drug safety organizations, I think is key for us to being successful. And it's not easy.
I can imagine, especially as you mentioned before, the old gold standard was animal testing.
Yeah.
So I assume that switching to your solution and accept that also requires a change in their processes, etc.
It definitely does. And it always pissed me off a little bit, if I may say so, because just because animal testing has been used for 20 years kind of does not make it the standard, right? So it's we very often have these discussions and people say, yeah, how does that compare to animal testing? And I say, well, first of all, tell me, how does animal testing compare to the clinic, right? It doesn't work. So why are we now measured against these animal models? But, it's probably a moot point because that's the way how things are, right? You have to accept it and you have to live with it. But it's definitely a big marketing and communication topic for us, because we need to understand what are the stakeholders that we talk to, and there are very often a lot of stakeholders in a pharmaceutical company. How do they tick, and what is their stance towards animal testing? But this is really changing now.
Do you see there also a force or more of an approach from a political level to really make changes in that regard?
Yeah. So interestingly, there is, I think, has always been a strong interest in Europe to change this. And for instance, in cosmetics testing, Europe has been a trailblazer in this field, right? So in, I think 2015, the European regulation for the ban of animal testing for cosmetics ingredients became a law. And everybody was, I think, a bit shocked because it happened quite quickly at the end of the day. And there was a lot of, of concerns that, this would really limit the industry, but it totally didn't. And it worked actually really well to test in human in vitro models. The pharmaceutical industry has not been this fast, and the politics have not been that fast. But the US now made a big step at the end of last year and approved a bill called the FDA Modernization Act 2.0. It doesn't look like much, but it is a lot, because what they basically instruct the FDA to do is to replace the word animal testing or the words animal testing by preclinical models. And so preclinical models are test animals, but they are also technologies like ours. And so what it does, it creates a level playing field between these technologies, right? So the problem that we had before, that a lot of customers said, hey, when we go to FDA, we rather go with animal testing because we've done this for 20 years and it kind of worked. I don't want to take a risk. So that problem, I think, is going to be substantially reduced in the next 2 years.
And if you think that further, right, it might even be the case that eventually animal testing will be banned from these regulations one day. Not today or tomorrow, but I could imagine that happen over the next few decades. And then you have sort of a forcing function to use exactly. Your solution.
Yeah. To me, a ban of animal tests, or let's say at least a severe restriction, I think is definitely one of the missions that we pursue with the team at InSphero. But we are very realistic about it, right? It's not something that happens quickly. For instance, what we do and what many of our competitors do is they look at a single organ type, at the liver, at skin, at the heart muscle. But of course, we are an organism that's made up of a lot of different tissues that are interacting with each other. And there are situations where a drug might be not toxic for the liver, but the liver produces a side product which is then toxic for the heart. And that sort of complexity today is still very difficult to mimic in vitro. And that's where then systemic models today, animals, kind of still play a relevant role. But we also think further, and we work on technologies where we can combine different microtissues into a chip where we then can test crosstalk between these tissues. So, we've identified the need and we work on solutions, but I think we're talking like 15 to 20 years.
Fair. But the closer you get to that level, the more likely you make animal testing obsolete.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And there is a lot of drive for that in the industry, because a lot of the new modalities for drugs kind of do not work in animals, right? If you think about the COVID vaccines, mRNA type of vaccines, if you think gene therapy, which is now, starting to become a thing for certain genetic diseases, these are therapeutics that are made for humans and for humans only. They do not work in a rat or in a mouse. Just don't, right? And so these researchers, need models that they can rely on, that give them proper data. And also the regulatory agencies start accepting that it doesn't make sense to force researchers to test on a mouse just because it has been done, right? Science dictates the mouse is just secreting this the next day and nothing happens. So let's not do the thing at all.
Sounds reasonable to me. The other challenge I want to talk to you about is the need for funds. In your space, usually you have a very high need for funds to really develop and even get close to releasing something. How was that for you, and how did you tackle that challenge?
So if you are a purely pharmaceutical startup that is discovering a new drug, you typically have no revenue, right? And everything is bankrolled by the investors. In our case, it's a little bit different because we generated revenue basically from the second year because our products do not need to have FDA approval, so they can be sold as such. So we always had cash flow from the services and products that we provide, but we still raised in total about 50 million so far. We did it, I think, in a very Swiss way, starting with a 1.8 million Series A round, right? Today, people laugh about that and say it's not even a seed financing round, right? But 14 years ago, this was a lot of money, and it was definitely a lot of money for us. And it allowed us to grow to the next value inflection point and so on and so on. But we see that things are very different if you look across the pond. We have a competitor in the US. They have raised 260 million, right? And they do a lot less revenue than we do. But it's just a different way how things are done, right?
But that's crazy. I recently also saw in the software area some comparison between Europe and the US, exactly the same what you say. Valuations usually lower in Europe, but the revenue is often higher than the US competitor.
Yeah.
And that's just astonishing to me. Isn't that like very annoying for you as a startup founder to say, hey, we actually do a better job because we have a higher revenue, maybe even a better technology, but the guys over there get so much more money. That's just unfair.
Yeah, so if you ask me, do I want to have 260 million, I would probably say yes, right? But it comes, of course, with a lot of liabilities. And so the way how we do things in Europe, I think, is not necessarily bad. It could be easier to do fundraising, but to me, the important point has always been we need to have a fair valuation, right? A fair valuation for us, for what we have achieved as founders and as a team at InSphero, but also a fair valuation for the investors that invest into the company. Because at some point you want to do an IPO or you want to have a liquidity event, and then everybody needs to be happy. And if you have a lot of unhappy investors, you might even not be able to do your trade sale because they block it. And so I think the way how we have operated, which is interestingly very similar to one of our competitors in the Netherlands, so similar fundraising, similar revenue, I think we can, I'm convinced that when we have a liquidity event, that every investor is going to be happy. And if we had raised a lot more and also had a valuation that is a lot higher, we might not be able to, create sufficient financial KPIs to make it work. So for us, I think the fairness has always been kind of the central paradigm. Can you ask for more? Can you create a hype? You can, but it might bite you in the ass at some point. And so we're sort of happy with this. And the thing is, if you have a lot of money, you also tend to spend a lot of money. We've always been quite conservative. In some areas, more would have been better. But I'm totally happy and glad that we have the commitment by our investors.
This is probably not the answer that the listeners expected, because they thought maybe more money is better, as you just put it. But I take away two things. It's actually better because it disciplines you to be more disciplined and focused on your money, on your expenses, basically. But at the same time, it also creates more opportunity for a good liquidation event in the future compared to just having a high valuation. And then the potential buyers are just much smaller.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk about internationalization. You have a strong presence in the US.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about that as a Swiss company to expand over the pond to the US?
Yeah, so one of my investors, a very experienced business person in the life science field, he said, there are only two ways how you do it, right? You do it on a shoestring and you will fail, or you do it solidly and you go all in, and then you can have a success. And so we decided to take that second road. The US is very important for us. About half of every dollar that's spent on pharma R&D is spent in the US. It's a very large, coherent market. We do more than 50% of our revenue in the US, albeit being a Swiss company. But it was very clear for us that we needed a US presence, also a physical presence. And so we actually have two companies in the US, still a small team, but it helps us to be kind of recognized as a local company. And so our customers have a local person to talk to. And I think that was very important for us. The challenge, aside from again, financing this, right? Setting up the site, putting a team together, that all costs a lot of money. But the biggest challenge that we've seen is kind of cultural silos between the US team and the Swiss team. Mm-hmm. And that has really plagued us for a couple of years. When things go wrong, then immediately finger pointing starts and so on, right? And you cannot have this in a small company. One of the few advantages that you have as a small company, I think, is coherence, team spirit, right? The David against Goliath thing. And if you kind of break up that camaraderie, I think then it gets very, very quickly difficult. And so we had to make some adjustments to make sure that things work. And now it's fantastic, right? There's a lot of back and forth, and we even have a C-level person, Madhu Nak, who is she's our chief scientific officer. She lives in the US, but works very well with the team that she manages here. But at the same time, she's also present in the US to talk to our customers. And so it's this back and forth, I think, that can really help us to be better.
How does that look from a very practical perspective? Do you yourself spend a lot of time in the US because of the importance of the revenue and the local team?
I do, and we do. Of course, the pandemic has helped us to see when is it necessary to go and when can we do things through online conferences. And I think that was really helpful. But we spent a lot of time in the US. So for me, it's pretty much every 6 weeks or so, 8 weeks that I'm in the US. But we also have a lot of US conferences. And but this is kind of normal, right? So I just came back from the American Association of Cancer Research Congress. It's the biggest in the world. And it's also very important for Europeans. So you also meet your customers from kind of next door in Orlando, Florida. So it's a bit how our industry works.
And what do you bring to the US and what do you keep in Switzerland? Is it mainly sales and marketing focused, where you say, we want to build presence there, so we mainly have sales and marketing activities in the US with the US team? Or do you bring in additional jobs and areas to the US beyond that?
Yeah, so we have a whole roadmap on this. The focus initially was on sales and marketing. But some of our products are of prime importance for our customers. So they test every compound that goes through the development process on our liver tissues. And these are like 400, 500, 600 per year. And when you then become a single source supplier, the companies, our customers, are looking very, very closely. And typically the rule is you have to have 2 independent production sites and one needs to be in the US, because they never want to have a situation where we have a water damage or something like that. And we say, hey, we can't ship for the next 8 weeks because it means them slowing down. So building a production site in the US, not an R&D, but production site, was a logical next step. But in the future, we would also like to do more R&D in the US because there are a lot of talents in the US. There's also a lot of research funding, but research funding that needs to stay in the US, that cannot not be kind of siphoned off to Switzerland, which is totally understandable. So having a bigger presence there is for us a clear objective.
And talking about that talent pool in the US, being there, having the presence there, is that an advantage because you have access to an additionally huge talent pool? Or is it also a challenge because I assume it's way more competitive than here over in Europe?
Yeah.
What outweighs, the pros or the cons?
We'll have to find out on the R&D side. I think that also in the US, a lot of, especially folks in the young workforce, they are very purpose driven, right? So they need to get a decent salary. They want to be treated fairly, but they think more about, is this really what I want to do? And so companies like us, and I'm sure also many others, but just speaking for us, I think they have a purpose that a lot of people can identify with, and that helps us to get great talent on board.
And one last very practical question about the US expansion. How do you structure that with the investors? Do you have all the investors in the Swiss entity and you just have a subsidiary in the US, or is it the other way around?
No, that's how it's structured. So everybody's invested in Switzerland, and the two US companies, they are full subsidiaries of InSphero.
Perfect. That's just out of curiosity, because some people think, oh, how do I best structure this if I would ever want to bring my company there?
I think it's a great point, and we do not yet have a institutional US investor in InSphero. Like 7 years ago or so, we started to talk to US VCs for fundraising. And I think there was a lot of interest in what we do. There was also not really concern about the valuation that we had, right? It was more like, okay, this is cheap. But the second question that immediately came was, how quickly can you move the company to the US? And I think the US might have been an interesting area to continue the journey. We were maybe 20, 25 people at the time. But the reason why we did the fundraise was we wanted to be 150% focused on serving our customers and creating the right products and accelerating the kind of industrialization and commercialization of our technology. And if we had moved the company to the US, we would have basically wasted a year finding new people, winding down operations in Switzerland, moving everything over, a year that our competitors would have used to overtake us, right? So this was clear. We didn't want to do it.
Certainly, yeah. So now InSphero is fulfilling its noble mission, growing all the way. What are your next milestones that you want to tackle over the next few months and potentially also years?
We are entering, I think, a quite interesting phase because we have worked on a lot on our internal operations, processes, production, and so on. One of the kind of missing links that we had was making our solutions storable. And we have been working on that for 4 years together with the Technical University in Rapperswil and Hamilton Robotics in Bonaduz in Grison. And we are now able to freeze tissues. So that's a big milestone for us, because instead of always producing and selling fresh tissues, we can now produce in larger batches and then store this. So it makes everything a lot more scalable.
Wow.
And with the scalability, of course, comes an opportunity to bring new technologies in-house. And so we're now looking at either academic groups or small startups that have developed 3D tissue models for diseases that we are not currently tackling, who have an interest to get acquired early on, because we can bring those onto our platform very quickly. We have the marketing in place, we have the sales in place, we have the scientific support in place to help our customers being successful. And I think we see a lot of small companies that, start with a big aspiration, but then see the market is not as big as they thought, or it takes a lot longer to get there, or they've underestimated the cost of development and so on. And I think for these, we could be a fantastic home where we can retain the talent, bring the talent on board, and expand our portfolio very quickly.
That sounds amazing. It's super exciting at the same time.
It totally is. And we have a lot of respect for these merger and acquisition processes to find the right companies, but also after we have a deal to make the deal work and make sure that the people get on board, right? That everything works out well. Yeah. If you talk to people about mergers, everybody says, well, they fail in 70% of the cases or in 80% of the cases. But I think for us, it's a bit different because we look at very embryonic companies that have just started, that have not built a rigid culture with a lot of I do this, you do that kind of silos, but more scientists / entrepreneurs that just want to make it happen. And so I believe that if we do things well, integration will be successful and will accelerate things.
Absolutely. And you talked about the importance of a potential liquidity or liquidation event. What role does that play on your next milestones? Is an IPO or a trade sale something that you're thinking about these days?
No, we're not working towards that. And I think it's good because it'll happen one way or the other, right? And I think if you have this too much in your mind, it just defocuses you from what's really important. And what's really important, that we develop kick-ass solutions that people really like, and that people cherish us as a partner and they want to work with us, and we build these bonds, right? This is what really counts. Right. And then the acquisition options through a trade sale or a potential IPO will materialize themselves, right? I'm aware that especially an IPO needs the right planning, but we do it when the time's right for it. But we don't have schedule where we say, now we do this, now we do that. We want to grow as a company. We want to grow through our own positive cash flow, right? And then we can choose the options. And that's, I think, what helps us to get the best deal.
Sounds like a perfect plan from my perspective.
Let's talk in 5 years.
Exactly. So Jan, to wrap up the conversation, we also prepared some rapid fire questions for you. Yeah. I either give you different options to choose from or a short question, and you have to answer in one sentence.
Okay, I'll try to.
Let's go. Researcher or entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's easy. Entrepreneur. But with a scientific background, that's key for me.
Science-backed entrepreneur.
Yeah.
What's a habit you wish you could quit?
So I'm too optimistic in planning my time and my schedule, and then I delay or under-deliver, and I would really like to change that. And I think 100% of my staff members at InSphero would like that as well.
And what's a habit you wish you could adopt?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm working on is to be more candid in my feedback. So I'm German born. I lived in Switzerland now for 25 years. I'm very friendly, right? And so sometimes giving candid feedback is a tricky thing in our culture, right? We're try to sugarcoat things and to wrap criticism in a couple of compliments, and not everybody understands that. And I talked to some of my industry peers, very experienced managers in some of the organizations that I'm active in, and I think throughout that group, when you ask them what is that really changed how you manage and lead teams, most of them said, being more candid, being more direct in the positive and in the negative, right? Yeah. And you can also be direct in the positive. Sure. And it makes it much easier to, when something bad happens, to also criticize clearly. But your team knows when things go well, they also get the compliment, right? And so putting this in place, and the idea is that once I master it, I hope that everybody else picks it up as well. I think it can really help us as an organization to thrive.
Absolutely. And the last one for you today, I know you travel a lot. You said before, every 6 to 8 weeks. Are you fed up of the long haul flights?
I think I'm okay with that. It gives me time to think and to reflect and to relax. So I very, very rarely buy a Wi-Fi pass on a plane.
I wanted to say nowadays there's even Wi-Fi on the plane.
No, I totally don't like that because, I have a couple, I typically take things, and they can also be private, some good stuff to read or a photo album to prepare on the computer. So it's a bit of me time that I cherish.
That's a nice way of seeing it. Yeah.
It's not good from a CO2 footprint perspective. I totally acknowledge that. But it's still something that I like very much. Yeah.
Jan, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was really fun to record this episode with you and amazing to see what you've built with InSphero. All the best and lots of success for the future.
Thanks very much for making that easy for me and for the great questions.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, you can support us by rating our show on Apple Podcasts. This way, we can reach an ever-growing number of aspiring entrepreneurs.